Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be getting into data collection in HCI,
Mm.
human-computer interaction.
Yeah.
For those of you who maybe haven't heard that acronym before,
Right.
you're in the right place if you're interested in figuring out how people use technology and all the different ways that we can learn about that.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think it's really interesting that we're calling this like creative data collection
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like data collection sometimes gets a bad rap as being very dry,
Right.
you know?
Right.
Just like numbers in a spreadsheet.
Totally. It's so much more than that, though.
Right.
Data is really kind of the foundation of understanding anything, really. And at HCI, it's really what helps us answer these questions about how people are using website, how they're using apps, how they're
Yeah.
using virtual reality even.
Yeah.
Um, but the way that we get that data is really where the creativity, I think, comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think when people think about research and data collection, they do think of someone with a stopwatch timing someone using a computer.
Yeah.
But clearly it's more than that, right?
It's definitely more than that. I mean, those traditional methods, I think they have their place.
Yeah.
They can be really helpful. But as you said, it can be really time consuming
Yeah.
and kind of clunky sometimes.
Yeah.
And HCI are dealing with human behavior,
Right.
which is messy and complex.
Absolutely.
So we need methods that can really capture that richness.
Yeah, and that's where these creative methods come in. And one of the things that our sources talk about is something called probes,
Mm-hmm.
which sounds very futuristic to me.
It does sound
Yeah.
very futuristic. It's a
Yeah.
little less spaceships and a little more just kind of ingenuity.
Okay.
But you can kind of think about probes as these tools that you would give to a user, almost like a creative kit,
Okay.
to help them express their experiences with technology.
So it's less about getting those hard data points and more about understanding kind of their story and their experience.
Yeah, definitely probes are all about gathering data kind of indirectly, especially in situations where you can't necessarily be there watching someone
Right.
use
Yeah.
technology in their natural environment.
Yeah, like an ethnographer who's going and like
Right.
living amongst a population. Yeah.
Exactly.
So you're trying to get a glimpse into their world through these probes.
Yeah.
And there are two types of probes that our sources mention: cultural probes and infrastructural probes,
Yes.
which sound very different.
They do sound very different.
Yeah.
So tell me about those.
Yeah, so cultural probes are super interesting. They were actually kind of pioneered by a researcher named Bill Gaver
Okay.
back in the 90s.
Okay.
And he was really interested in trying to capture the feelings and the stories behind technology.
Okay.
So not just like, what button did you press and how long did it take you?
Right.
But like, how do you feel about using this?
Interesting.
What's your like emotional connection to this technology?
Yeah.
So you can imagine like giving someone a disposable camera.
And saying, like, take pictures that represent your relationship with technology.
Wow, yeah.
Or giving them a journal with all these different prompts.
Right.
And saying, like, at the end of each day, like, reflect on your digital day. Like, how did you feel?
That's so much more interesting than a survey.
It is. It's so much more engaging.
Yeah.
And I think you can learn a lot more about someone's, like, motivations
Totally.
and emotions that way.
Yeah, for sure. And I think even for someone who's listening to this, who's designing a website or an app,
Right.
you can imagine how that kind of data would be so valuable
Absolutely.
to figure out,
Yes.
are people having like a delightful experience?
Yeah. Are they frustrated?
Yeah.
Are they bored? Are they
Yeah.
engaged?
Yeah. Are they confused?
All of those things.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. Okay, so cultural probes.
Yeah.
All about the field. What about these infrastructural probes? Because that sounds way more like structured
Yeah.
and kind of like
concrete. Yeah. So infrastructural probes, you can kind of think about as a way to understand how technology is functioning within a certain system.
Okay.
So like a workplace,
Got it.
for example. And so researchers would use these probes to see how people were really using technology on the job,
Interesting.
not just what they said they were doing.
Right, like how they thought they should be doing it
Good
or
job.
what the, whatever.
Exactly. And so this can be really helpful for like identifying usability issues,
Mm-hmm.
getting feedback on IT systems,
Yeah.
and just ultimately making technology work better
Right.
for people in their work lives.
So if you're designing software that's going to be used in the workplace,
Yes,
these are really good methods for you.
absolutely.
Okay, cool. So we've got these probes,
Yeah.
but our sources also talk about diaries as a data collection method.
Mm-hmm.
So is this literally just like asking people to keep a journal
Yeah,
about their tech use?
pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah, literally having people keep a diary of their experiences,
Yep.
their activities, their reflections over a certain period of time.
Yeah, I can see how that would be so valuable, but I also imagine it's got to be difficult to design a study like that,
It can be.
where,
Yeah.
people actually want to take the time to do that.
Right, because life gets busy.
Right.
So as a researcher, you have to think a lot about, like, how do I minimize the burden on the participant?
Yeah.
How do I make this diary something that they actually want to engage with?
Right.
And then even just like, what's the format of the diary?
Right. What's the right format?
Is it like a paper and pencil diary?
Yeah.
Is it electronic?
Right.
Is it text-based? Is it voice-based?
Right.
So yeah, there's a lot of different design decisions that go into
Yeah.
creating a good diary study.
Cool. So,
Yeah. There are a bunch of different types of diaries too.
okay.
Like you could have a general diary where someone's just kind of giving you a broad overview of their experiences. You could have a time diary where someone's really tracking like how much time they're spending on certain activities.
Okay.
You could have a feedback diary
Right.
where someone's specifically giving you feedback on like a certain app
Got it.
or a website.
Yeah.
You could even have something called an elicitation diary
Okay.
where the diary entries are actually kind of used as a starting point for like further investigation or interviews.
Ah, so many diaries.
So many diaries.
So little time to keep them.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these diaries, we've got these probes, and then our sources kind of take a turn into the world of automated data collection, which sounds very high tech.
Yeah, this is where we can really start to leverage the power of computers to help us like gather and process data.
Okay, so less pen and paper, more algorithms.
Yeah, more ones and zeros.
Ones and zeros, yeah. Is any part of you, well, I'm sure part of you is thinking about like the ethical implications of this, but is any part of you like a little like, oh, this feels a little big brothery now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
Right? It's like just because we can collect tons of data automatically
Right.
doesn't mean that we should.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think as researchers, we always have to be thinking about the ethical implications.
Yeah, and being very upfront about that with people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's all about being responsible with this technology.
Totally. Okay, so with those ethical considerations in mind,
Yes.
let's dive into some specifics.
Okay.
Our sources mention something called weblogs. So I'm imagining like a captain's log,
Yeah.
but for the internet.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So every time that you visit a website,
Okay.
you click a link, you download something, it's all being recorded in a log.
Got it.
So timestamps pages visited,
Okay.
what type of browser you're using, all that is being tracked.
Wow, so it's like a whole history of my movements
Pretty much.
online.
Yeah, like digital footprints.
Yeah, and so what kinds of things can you learn from that?
Businesses use this type of data all the time to figure out how are people using our websites.
Right.
Are they getting lost? Are they finding what they need?
Right, are there any like dead ends on the website? Yeah.
So it can be really helpful for improving like usability,
Right.
maybe even like tailoring content.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure there are challenges to using this data
Absolutely.
ethically, as we've been talking about.
Yeah, so like anonymity is key.
Right. You can't be like, oh, this person was looking at this.
Exactly. You can't tie it back to a specific person
Right.
without their consent.
Right.
And then the other big challenge is just the sheer volume of data,
Yeah.
right? So it's like you need specialized tools and expertise to even like sift through all of that and find the meaningful patterns.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we've got weblogs. We've also got something called stored application data
Yes.
that our sources mention. Is that related?
Yeah, so it's a similar idea, but instead of like tracking your activity online,
Okay.
this is about the data that apps and software store about how you use them.
Okay.
So like your file system, your browsing history within an app, even your activity on social media.
Oh, so like when I'm scrolling through Instagram,
Exactly.
that's all being logged somewhere?
Potentially, yeah.
Interesting. And so what can researchers do with that kind of data?
So they can use this data to understand how people are using technology in their everyday lives. Like what features do they use the most? What are some of the pain points?
Right.
Where are they getting stuck?
Yeah. Are there any limitations to this kind of data, though, or like ethical considerations?
Yeah, I think the biggest limitation is that you're kind of restricted to the data that the application itself decides to store.
Okay.
Right. So you can't analyze what you don't have.
Right.
And then, of course, privacy is a huge concern here.
Yeah.
This is like very personal data.
Right.
So transparency, user consent, like those are absolutely essential.
Right. You can't just be like, oh, I'm just going to use this.
Exactly. It has to be very above board.
Yeah. Okay. So we're getting even deeper into this world of automated data collection?
Mm,
Because our sources talk about something called activity logging.
yes.
What is being logged?
So you can kind of think about activity logging as like web logs on steroids,
Okay.
right? So now we're talking about specialized software
Okay.
that can capture really granular details.
Okay.
So your keystrokes, your mouse movements,
Wow.
even how long you spend on a specific task within an application.
That's intense.
Yeah.
And what kind of software are we talking about here? Like, what is actually doing the logging?
So there are a couple of main categories, I would say.
Okay.
First, we have what are called proxies.
Okay.
And so you can kind of think about a proxy as like a middleman
Okay.
between your computer and, let's say, a web server.
Okay.
And so it's kind of intercepting all of the traffic
Got it.
between your computer and the server.
So it's like listening in
Exactly.
on the conversation.
Yeah. And it can record data about those interactions.
Wow. So it's like the silent observer of
Yeah.
my digital conversations.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've got proxies. And then what was the other category?
The other one is interaction recording tools.
Okay.
And so this is kind of the heavy hitter.
Okay.
So now we're talking about software that can actually record your screen activity,
Wow.
maybe even your audio.
Whoa.
So it's capturing literally every click, every scroll,
wow.
every keystroke.
That's wild. And I bet there's a lot of really cool things you can learn from that data. But I also imagine
For sure.
that the ethical considerations are
Huge.
huge
Yes.
with that.
Yeah. I mean, using these tools requires a great deal of responsibility.
Yeah.
Informed consent is absolutely paramount.
Yeah.
You can't just be recording someone's screen without them knowing and agreeing to it.
Right.
And then data security is critical as well.
Right.
We need to make sure that this sensitive information is being stored and handled responsibly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've been talking about software that already exists that you can use to collect data, but our sources also mention something called custom software.
Yes.
What is that all about?
So this is where things get really interesting.
Good.
Sometimes researchers need very specific data
Right.
that they can't get from any pre-existing tools.
Right.
So they actually develop their own software that's tailored to their research questions.
That is really cool. I mean, it sounds very powerful, but also probably requires a lot of technical expertise.
It does. It's a very specialized skill set.
Yeah.
And there are kind of two main approaches, I would say.
Okay.
One is what we call instrumented software.
Okay.
So this is where you're basically taking existing software and modifying it
Okay.
to include data collection features.
So like you're taking a very familiar app
Exactly.
and just giving it like this superpower.
Yeah, basically like adding some tracking to a popular app.
Got it. Okay. What's the other approach?
The other approach is building what we call research software from the ground up.
Okay.
So this is software that's specifically designed for research purposes.
Got it.
And it's often focused on how users are completing tasks.
Okay.
Or maybe measuring their performance on certain tasks.
Wow. So you can get really, really specific
With your questioning.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I imagine even more ethical considerations with custom software.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're building software specifically to collect data, you have to be extra vigilant about user privacy,
Right.
data security. All of those ethical considerations become even more important.
Yeah. Transparency is key.
Transparency is key, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we've got this custom software, and of course we can't forget about the elephant in the room, which is the internet. Such a vast and ever-changing landscape.
It is.
I bet it presents like very unique opportunities for data collection.
It does. It really does. The online world is kind of like a living laboratory for understanding human behavior, and it allows us to study interactions as they're happening in these natural settings in a way that we never could before.
Yeah.
And we can reach these huge, diverse populations online
Right.
that we might not be able to reach otherwise.
It's like a gold mine
It is.
of data out
Yeah.
there. But I bet there are challenges to collecting
Oh, for sure.
data online as well.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is establishing rapport and trust online.
That's a really good point.
It's like, how do you build a connection with someone
Yeah.
you've never met face to face?
Right.
It's tricky.
Yeah, you can't read their body language as
Right.
easily.
Exactly. Or like pick up on those subtle social cues.
Right.
So yeah, it definitely requires a different approach.
Right, and being extra sensitive, I would imagine,
Absolutely.
in the way that you're communicating and
Yeah.
building that trust.
For sure.
Okay, so how do people actually do it? How do researchers actually collect data
Yeah.
in this online world?
There's a whole buffet of methods to choose from.
Okay, like what? Give me some examples.
So one approach is what we call observational studies.
Okay.
You can kind of think of this as like a digital anthropologist,
Okay.
right? So you're observing user behavior
Mm-hmm.
in these natural online environments.
So like looking at what people are doing on social media,
Exactly.
like their conversations and how they're interacting.
Yeah, like analyzing discussions on social media platforms or forums
Yeah.
and just seeing how are people interacting with each other?
Right.
How are they interacting with technology? You can learn a lot about online behavior that way.
That's really cool. So it's almost like you're a fly on the wall,
Yeah,
but in the digital world.
exactly.
Very cool. Um, what other methods are there?
Another really interesting method is called human computation.
Okay.
It's a mouthful,
It is a mouthful.
but it's a really cool concept.
Break it down for me.
So imagine harnessing the collective intelligence
Okay.
of thousands, even millions of people online
Wow.
to gather data or even conduct experiments.
So they're like crowdsourcing data collection.
Exactly. It's crowdsourcing at its finest.
Wow. How does that actually work?
So platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk
Oh, okay.
are a great example of this.
Okay.
Researchers can use these platforms to recruit participants for large-scale studies.
Got it.
They can get feedback on designs.
Okay.
They can even label data sets for machine learning. It's
Wow.
a way to really tap into this global brain
That's so cool.
to answer research questions.
Yeah. Are there any challenges with that kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is data quality,
Okay.
right? Because you're relying on people who are often completing these micro tasks
Right.
for very little compensation.
Right.
So you have to design those tasks very carefully.
Yeah.
You have to make sure the instructions are clear.
Right.
You have to build in quality control measures.
Right.
You have to be aware of potential biases.
Right. So it's like a balance between like efficiency and
Exactly.
making sure you're getting good data.
Yeah. Exactly. It's not just about collecting a lot of data.
Mm-hmm.
It's about collecting good data.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've got these observational studies. We've got this human computation. What other methods are out there? So
Yeah.
we've got these observational studies. We've got this human computation. What other methods are out there?
Yeah, those are definitely like two of the big ones. But you're right, there's a whole world of online data out there.
Right.
And the lines between these methods can get kind of blurry too.
Right.
You know, you might combine observational data from social media with a crowdsourced experiment.
Right.
So it's really all about using the right tool for the job and, of course, you know, keeping those ethical considerations that we've been talking about top of mind.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not about like finding the one true method.
Right.
It's about understanding like what are all the tools available, what are their strengths and weaknesses,
Exactly.
and then how do we put them together?
Yeah. And I think that's a great point to kind of bring us back to our deep dive today. You know, whether it's these creative methods like probes and diaries or harnessing the power of automation and online data,
Yeah.
there's no one-size-fits-all in HCI.
Right.
The key is to choose methods that really align with your research questions, that respect user privacy,
Right.
and ultimately help us better understand this really incredible dance between humans and technology.
That's beautifully put. It's a dance. It's not
It is.
just a one-way street.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we're coming to a close here, but before we go, I do have one last question for you.
Okay.
And it kind of goes back to something that you've emphasized throughout our conversation, which is the ethical considerations. As technology keeps evolving, which it's doing at lightning speed these days, what's the most important thing that you want our listener to remember about like the ethics of data collection?
That's such an important question. I think for me, it really boils down to this idea that data is never neutral. It's always a reflection of choices.
Right.
The choices that we make as researchers, as designers, even as users. Right. And so we have this responsibility to be critical thinkers, to question our assumptions, and to really make sure that everything we do is grounded in ethics and a deep respect for the people behind the data.
I love that it's not just about the numbers. It's about
the stories.
the stories. Yeah, the human stories.
Exactly.
Data with heart.
I love that.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you so much for this incredible deep dive. I feel like I learned so much, and I hope our listener did too.
The pleasure was all mine. Until next time.